My name is Adebayo Olukoshi. Most people call me Bayo. And currently I'm based at the School of Governance at Wits University in Johannesburg. Basically as a research professor at the university. I have, over the last 3 decades or so, had a career that took me to various parts of Africa and also parts of Europe. I came back to the continent after my doctoral studies to work at the Institute of International Affairs in Lagos. And then after a few years, I joined the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden and the South Center in Geneva, Switzerland, and then returned to the continent and had the privilege of serving for 2 terms as the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. After my tenure in CODESRIA, I took over the directorship of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, which is known as UNEDEP, also headquartered in Dakar, and concurrently served as the acting director, interim director of the Africa Governance Institute, which was at the time an initiative of 3 continental organizations, the AU, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the Africa Development Bank. When I left Dakar at the end of my 2nd term at IDEP, I went to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA for short, lived in Addis Ababa, where the headquarters for Africa and the Middle East is located, and from where I ran the operations of the institute across the continent and in the Middle East. And 2 years ago, I moved on to the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Now, I've had a long history of association with CODESRIA, so much so that I think in the 1990s, in the context of some of the debates about the future of CODESRIA, I started off by introducing myself as a child of CODESRIA, which basically spoke to this close interrelationship which my generation of African young researchers at the time had with CODESRIA. Not only in terms of participation in CODESRIA research and training networks, but also in building and honing our skills as researchers on the platforms of the Council, various platforms of the Council. I took an active part, for example, in the network that the Council had created on social movements in Africa, contributed a chapter, but also became the pioneer director of the CODESRIA Governance Institute, which sought to build interest and enhance capacity amongst African young scholars in matters of governance research on the continent. So a training institute when it was conceived and established. But above all else, CODESRIA as a source of inspiration for many in my generation, which basically helped us to be able to frame intellectual agendas for the continent and also develop interpretative frameworks of analysis that sought to be as original and as faithful as possible to the history and context of our continent. It was my fortune several years later, at the dawn of the new millennium, 2001, to be appointed as, I believe, the 5th Executive Secretary of the Council. And I served 2 terms in the Council. Once you have been part of CODESRIA, you never leave CODESRIA. Even if you are away for a period of time, inevitably, given CODESRIA's towering presence in the African intellectual landscape, CODESRIA remains an abiding part of your journey at all times. As a former executive secretary of the council, I've remained very active in the work of the organization and in its well-being also. And currently, I also serve as the chair of the scientific committee of the council. Yeah, this will not be so much from my direct experience as much as what some of our senior colleagues in the first and even to some extent second generation of the post-independence social science community shared with us. And usually CODESRIA meetings were structured in a way that for us who drew inspiration from the work of the council, the formal sessions of any CODESRIA activity were as important as the informal sessions. And those informal sessions usually served as the occasion for the transmission of information and knowledge about the history of the council, its making, its growth, its expansion. So when CODESRIA started, I was probably still in my very early formative years in life. But it was clear that the founding objective of the council, which remains an impeccable objective, was to combat the fragmentation of the social research community on the continent. So that at independence, of course, in a majority of the countries of the continent, social science researchers, and what was later modified in order to make it as broad as possible to the social research community, was growing. But that growth was uneven. And in some countries of the continent, there was actually a deliberate attempt to suppress certain aspects of the disciplines of the social sciences in order to limit the scope for intellectual subversion, quote unquote. But nevertheless, I think overall one could say that in most universities at independence into the early 70s when CODESRIA was founded, the higher education was expanding, and within it, the social research component of social sciences and humanities were also growing overall. However, there was very little space within Africa for social researchers on the continent to meet and to interact. And it often was the case, as we were told, that wherever African scholars in the social sciences and the humanities met, it tended to be outside of the continent on the basis of an agenda developed by others to which they had been invited, and on platforms which they did not necessarily have control over in terms of whatever strategic objectives. And that began the process of brainstorming to create a platform in Africa that eventually culminated in the establishment of CODESRIA. And that process initially targeted the leaders, the heads of centers, institutes, and faculties of social science and humanities, social and economic research particularly, were targeted, and under the overall leadership of the late Samir Amin, CODESRIA was born under those circumstances. And that continued until the 1990s. From 1973 to the 1990s, CODESRIA was really built on the basis of institutional membership of institutes, centers, and faculties of social and economic research on the continent. And it was only in the 1990s, interestingly, in the context of the crisis of higher education in Africa as a whole. It was the period of structural adjustment. It was the period of the retrenchment of the social expenditure of the state. And it was also a period of the decimation of the post-colonial middle class that was in formation. And all of these converged in a way that created a crisis of financing and even of functioning of the universities, that in part also became a crisis of mission of the universities of higher education. And in the midst of that crisis, the General Assembly of CODESRIA, which took place in the early 1990s, debated the developments on the continent, and amongst other things, one of the mini revolutions that occurred was the decision to open up membership to individuals, individual membership. And I'm proud that I took an active part in that struggle to, quote unquote, democratize membership. And largely because many of the institutional members of the council, remember it started as a council of institutional members, many of those institutions were themselves in difficulty to such a point where they could not even finance their own attendance at the General Assembly of their own council. The budgets had dried up, currencies were being devalued, scientific research was not a priority for most governments, and so on and so forth. And if we did not carry out that modification in the membership of the council, we may well have run into a governance crisis in CODESRIA, and it was partly a way for a younger generation of scholars to gain proper entry into the work and the workings of the council, but also simultaneously to renew the foundations of CODESRIA. And ever since then, I think one could argue that at different phases, sometimes corresponding with the changing intellectual and institutional landscape on the African continent, CODESRIA has found creative ways of responding and of adapting in order to remain as relevant as possible to the social research community, whilst simultaneously helping to catalyze new frontiers of knowledge production. Well, I mean, as I just explained, the transition from institutional membership to individual membership, which was heavily debated in the 1990s, was an important first step. At the same time as we were moving towards individual membership, which particularly favored the younger researchers, like me at the time, there was also a growing recognition, and there was a CODESRIA first gender symposium that was held in Dakar that attempted to begin a conversation within CODESRIA on gender questions. And it was not evident at the time that as an analytic category, people would embrace gender as an important arena of scholarly work and policy engagement. And to the extent to which, prior to the gender symposium, there was any serious attempt to introduce gender issues into the work of the council, it was largely done by our female seniors and colleagues, largely female, which in a sense, in retrospect, would have been unfortunate as a state of thing, as though gender was only about women and not a more broadly social question that should be of interest to everybody interested in justice, equity, and progress for our continent. But it was the period also when class analysis was privileged amongst most social scientists on the continent, in which it was assumed that everything boiled down, began with and ended with class, and therefore using the class analysis, whether Marxian or pseudo-Marxian, as an entry point to interpreting the dynamics of change on the continent was seen as the only logical and viable way to proceed. And it took quite a lot of insistence of pressure and ultimately of sustained knowledge production for gender to finally be incorporated consciously into the work of the Council. And as I said, the Gender Symposium that was held in the 90s was a starting point in that regard. Now, of course, in the context of that same period, in Dakar, there was the Association of African Women Researchers that was already established by the acronym AWOD. The impact of AWOD in building a platform, a Pan-African platform for female researchers, especially from the social sciences and humanities, to meet and to engage in a certain sense similar to what CODESRIA was doing for the broader social science community, was a very critical and important one. However, AWOD did have its own institutional challenges that sometimes undermined and even stymied its capacity to fully deliver on its mandate on a constant and continuing basis. Certainly much worse than anything that CODESRIA may have experienced in terms of its own challenges of institution building. At the end of the 1990s, I think it would be safe to say that CODESRIA became easily one of the most important platforms on the continent, not only for the mobilization of female researchers and young scholars, but also for the promotion of research on the dynamics of gender relations on our continent. And it was done in such a way because, after all, gender research and policy making on the continent was not a homogeneous, ideologically homogeneous terrain. There were those who were radical feminists. There were some who defined themselves as womanists. There were those who preferred simply to look at the dynamic of male-female power relations using the concept of gender with G. Subsequently, down the line, there were those who came with the idea of gender with J, Oyewumi and her colleagues, who wanted to bring what they called an original African interpretation and understanding of gender relations, distinct from Western feminism that seemed to be the dominant framework for a long time, but which was historically and culturally ill-adapted to the African historical and cultural context and experience. So all of these, of course, were, in a sense, evidence of a terrain where 1,000 flowers were blooming. And part of what CODESRIA, I think, did to its credit was to provide a credible space where those flowers could be allowed to bloom, for debates to take place around these issues, without formally defining CODESRIA as being in a particular line of whether feminist radical perspectives or gender with J or gender with G. So simply say we bring the different streams and strands together around specific thematic concerns and allow a debate to take place and publish the proceedings of those debates. So both on the youth front and on the gender front, CODESRIA did do very well. But inclusivity is also to be understood in terms of the openness of CODESRIA to the different disciplines that make up the social sciences and the humanities. And I think, again, it's to the credit of CODESRIA that, for example, history, even critical literature, people working in performance, fields of humanities that would not probably feature under normal conditions in a setup like CODESRIA were consciously brought in through, amongst other tools, the establishment of the CODESRIA African Humanities Institute. that was based in Accra at the University of Ghana in Legon. CODESRIA took it upon itself also to provide support to other continental associations of African scholars, support to the African Association of Political Science, support to the African Anthropological Association, support for the publication of an African Journal of Media Studies, introduction of an Africa Review of Books, various such initiatives, the publication of Africa Zamani, which was the official journal of African historians, financed by CODESRIA for many years, as part of that inclusivity of saying, in accordance with the mandate of CODESRIA to support the institutional basis of knowledge production in Africa, investments will be made to support those platforms to also help us to complete the robustness of the kind of scholarship that the Council supports, and I can go on. Yeah, the times are always changing in the field of funding for higher education. And the trigger factors would usually vary from period to period. But what I think has been a constant in many respects has been the fact that priorities have always shifted from the funding agencies. Strategic objectives have often been modified, sometimes midway, as to compel institutions like CODESRIA to step back and rethink their approach to resource mobilization. Now, I'll argue that the fact that CODESRIA has endured 50 years is itself testament to the fact that leadership and membership have been able to adapt to changing times and circumstances with a good degree of success. Which is not to say that there aren't important lessons to learn from all of those experiences in order to secure the next 50 years. But we might come back to that later on. What I think has been a constant element in all of the shifts that have taken place. For example, you might have a new leadership in some of the foundations with which CODESRIA has collaborated over the years and which have offered support to the Council. And a new leadership comes in and says that, well, our priority is not so much doing basic research, but rather supporting policy research. After the current round of agreement with CODESRIA, we are going to shift our interest and concern away from the type of work you do to the kind of policy research which we want to nurture, to promote, for example, engagement between knowledge and practice in our governmental processes. Those were some of the kinds of things that we've had to manage. In some other instances, it would be a change in regimes in some of the partner countries that offer support through their bilateral national agencies for the work that CODESRIA does. And some of those regime shifts can involve the replacement of a pro-research, pro-solidarity, pro-Africa engagement government by a more conservative government that in some instances we were told it's better to drill boreholes in rural communities in Africa than to give money to institutions like CODESRIA. Because at least with the boreholes, you see the results. With the work which you do in CODESRIA, we struggle to see what impact you are making, and you have to report more on impact and that kind of thing. As I said, there is no shortage of shifts that occur. The more contemporary changes which are taking place, of course, are reflective of a tide, particularly in Europe and the United States, of political change that is tending more towards the conservative and extremely conservative. a narrow nationalism, when you hear things like America first, Sweden first, a narrow nationalism which is hostile to any idea of solidarity and which in fact is anti-development cooperation in many respects. And although CODESRIA has not in most cases been completely cut off amidst all of these changes, I think it serves as an important wake-up call that we need to rethink some of the assumptions on the basis of which CODESRIA was founded and has grown and expanded over the years, and begin to think of other business models, quote unquote, that will help us to be fit for the future, or as some say, to be future-proof against some of the shocks that can come from sudden swings in direction from many of our donors. One point which I think is worth making, however, is that regardless of the direction in which the wind has blown over the years, one has to celebrate the fact that leadership in CODESRIA never ever agreed to compromise the academic freedom and the institutional autonomy of CODESRIA. And this is one of the things that makes CODESRIA still a unique institution, a safe platform which African scholars can engage with and to debate their concerns about the continent and about the world without having to look across their shoulders as to whether they would be made to suffer consequences for the positions that they take or the interpretative frames that they use, the methodologies that they deploy. That success in defending the academic freedom of the African scholar and of the institutional autonomy is certainly, in my view, one of the biggest assets that makes CODESRIA to remain relevant to its members, but above all, to be respected, even by some of its worst opponents. Okay, it's an issue which we've debated for years within the council. And the premise, the starting point, is that no people can really truly succeed in developing themselves, in transforming their economies and societies, in governing themselves in a manner that is anchored, organically embedded in the aspirations of their populations on the basis of borrowed ideas. And investing in knowledge capacity in Africa, by Africans, for the use of Africans, is an important element of any effort at socio-economic transformation. And of course, given the recent history of the continent, a culture became embedded by which it is assumed that the only ideas that matter, both for the purposes of producing knowledge on the continent, but also translating knowledge into policy, are those that come from outside the continent. The importation of knowledge through technical advisors, through consultants, and even through an academy in the West, in the US in particular, that is enmeshed in a rat race, publish or perish culture that churns out tons of literature about Africa and gives the impression that knowledge that matters and which is substantive about Africa is predominantly produced outside of the continent, has fed into this mentality of importing expertise, knowledge and expertise from outside the continent to seek to develop the continent. And we've seen that this has carried huge costs for us in Africa. I can illustrate this point very quickly. When at the end of the 1970s, African economies began to show signs of crisis, and there was a search for explanations about what may have gone wrong with the first 2 decades of efforts at consolidating independence, political independence, and also turning the table of underdevelopment on the continent. African scholars, a lot of them associated with CODESRIA, came with the idea that Africa needed to get politics right. And that meant effectively that we needed to reorganize the way in which we governed ourselves and by which decisions were made and implemented. All of the range of issues, institutional and process, associated with the administration of public affairs in our countries. The issue of power and how you manage it. Questions of succession, political succession in our countries that were at the heart of some of the instability that we saw in the 60s and 70s, some of the civil wars that were even fought, questions of participation and inclusion, management of diversity. All of these were encapsulated in the idea that African scholars promoted to understand the crisis as the need to get politics right. The World Bank, building on the report which it commissioned called the Berg Commission Report, argued, on the other hand, in contrast to African knowledge, that the issue actually was to get prices right. Prices, getting prices right, which was the precursor to structural adjustment. Structural adjustment which within the first decade of implementation basically destroyed all the gains of independence. And it's the kind of cost that we had to bear and which was really totally unnecessary. As I speak to you, there are still African countries today which have not resumed the levels of progress that they registered in 1979-80, when structural adjustment began to make its way to the continent. And it's a stark illustration of the price that we pay when we do not use local knowledge and expertise in our policy-making processes. Now, of course, you know the structure of power that is behind the African policy process. I talked about technical experts and advisors. So a donor comes to our finance minister and says, you need to do taxation reform. Even if you agree on the principle, the details of what is to be reformed is not necessarily informed by profound local knowledge, but by assumptions that actually government, you should be getting more revenue by taxing more or collecting taxes more efficiently. And that aid will then be for you to invite a company, a group of individuals or something from the country that is giving you the aid, or from a group of experts and consultants that the aid-giving country approves. And they come with very superficial knowledge. Some of them, it will be their first time of visiting Africa. And some of them, the only place they see outside of the finance ministry and the central bank is the swimming pool of the hotel where they are lodged. And they begin to become experts on Africa. This has been documented by many African scholars. And effectively, you begin to have the kinds of disconnect between policies which are pursued and the real lived experiences on the ground that effectively shows why what you think should work normally on the basis of theory that is imported actually fails to perform on the African continent. And you end up blaming Africa for the failure of those policies. Not so much that those policies were not grounded in knowledge of a sociological kind, of a political kind, of an ethnographic kind. But, you know, people just sit down and they think, well, you know, let's just run a statistical exercise, and then we can begin to draw conclusions without those conclusions being grounded in history, in context, in the sociological dynamics that are underway, and above all, even in the project of society, which a government or a ruling party might have developed as part of its engagement with the local population. So it's a long-winded way of saying to you that Africa is not going to really successfully achieve the goal of structural transformation, which our presidents have committed to, if we do not learn, first, to valorize local knowledge, and secondly, to take local knowledge as a starting point for policy process on our continent. It's often said that Africa and India went into structural adjustment. And while structural adjustment destroyed Africa, India used structural adjustment as a starting point for the re-emergence of India. And what is the difference? Very simple. Indian statisticians, economists, political economists, sociologists never accepted the data that came from Washington on face value. They went into negotiations with the IMF with data produced by Indian economists, Indian sociologists, Indian scholars. And when the World Bank would say, according to our projection, statistical projection, this is what will happen, India could argue that, okay, your data is wrong. Our own projection is as follows. You say on that side that the gap which we see is this, they say, no, you got it wrong. The gap which we see is here. And that way they were able to shift whatever external support that they mobilized in the name of structural adjustment behind priorities that were important to unleash the productive forces of India. One should be very careful not to be reduced to a futurologist, gazing at the crystal ball and making predictions of a kind which could turn out to be too far-fetched and too far removed from reality. But what I can safely say is that first and foremost, if there was no CODESRIA as we know it, we would have had to create one sooner or later. So it is great that the generation of scholars who initiated the council and who labored to build it through its teething phases of development had the prescient ability to be able to see the necessity for an institution of that kind. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, even if CODESRIA may not be where we all might wish it to be, it has recorded a huge success in overcoming challenges of growth and development, as to still be standing and standing firm 50 years after. Again, one of my predecessors, Tandikam Kandawire, used to say that the institutional landscape in Africa, and I dare say in many other parts of the world, is almost like a graveyard, where institutions appear on the horizon and look promising, and 5 years down the line, they are buried and forgotten. And there's a permanent creation, dissolution, death of institutions. CODESRIA has been able to demonstrate an agility and flexibility that enabled it not just to survive the tides of time, but also to develop and to grow itself. And this background, this double background, gives me the optimism that we can look forward to CODESRIA, not only being in existence, but conquering new frontiers 50, 100, 150 years down the line. In a certain sense, we've reached a point where CODESRIA has become sufficiently consolidated as an institution that not only belongs to a group of members of the council, but to the entire African research and policy community, almost as a heritage. And preserving that heritage does not only belong to those who manage the council at any point in time. Indeed, for CODESRIA, one of the positive benefits is that of its experience over the years is that many in the community also see this as their responsibility. If CODESRIA is quiet for 6 months, there will be many people writing letters to the Secretariat and asking what is going on. And that's an illustration of the fact that people own the council and feel a sense of ownership of the council and the responsibility that comes with ownership of the council on the basis of a popular foundation that has been laid and which has helped it to stand over the years. Of course, one cannot, on the basis of all of this, assume that we are entitled automatically to remain strong and relevant. There's still work to do. There will always be work to do. And for succeeding generations, I would hazard a guess that one of the key challenges will be, as I mentioned earlier on, to revisit the business model of the council, and secondly, to also, in line with the changing times and the changing needs of the scholarly community on the continent, to revamp the program structure and content of the work which the council does to ensure that it remains not only relevant to the generation of scholars to come, but also helps to scale new frontiers for the African social research community. Thank you.